Hey guys, let me tell you something that might completely change the way you think about the early 20th century, specifically that brief, shimmering, and supposedly elegant window we call the Edwardian era. When most people hear Edwardian, they immediately picture these massive, sun-drenched garden parties, women in enormous hats decorated with entire taxidermied birds, and men in crisp linen suits playing lawn tennis while sipping Pimm's. We think of Downton Abbey-style grandeur, where the biggest stressor was whether the fish fork was placed correctly or if the Duke of Marlborough was going to show up for tea. It's a period that's been shrink-wrapped in nostalgia, remembered as one long golden afternoon before the metaphorical and literal clouds of the Great War rolled in to ruin everything. And look, all of that is very pretty and makes for great period dramas that people love to binge watch on rainy Sundays. But what if I told you that for the vast majority of people living through it, the Edwardian era wasn't a sun-drenched garden party at all? What if the real story wasn't about the lace and the parasols, but about the sheer, bone-chilling, soul-crushing struggle to just stay warm? This is the boring story of Edwardian winters. Boring, of course, being entirely relative, because once you start digging into the logistics of how an entire society, from the king in Buckingham Palace to the dock worker in a London slum, coped with the brutal reality of a damp, freezing British winter without modern heating, you realize it was a feat of incredible endurance and obsessive preparation. It was a time when your entire daily routine, with your architecture, your clothing, and even your political priorities, were dictated by the BTU output of a lump of coal. We tend to forget that the Edwardian era, spanning roughly from 1901 to 1910, or extended by some historians up to 1914, was a period of extreme contrast. It was the height of the British Empire's outward power, but internally it was a society held together by a very fragile web of coal deliveries, heavy woolens, and a lot of sheer stoicism. So let me set the stage for you. To understand how they survived the winter, you first have to understand the political and social climate of the time, because in the Edwardian world, staying warm was a political act. This was the era of King Edward VII, a man who loved luxury, big cigars, and heavy meals. Yeah, but he was also a king who presided over a Britain that was starting to feel the cracks in its own foundation. The Victorian certainty of the previous century was fading. The empire was huge, sure, but the Boer War had just given the British military a massive reality check, revealing that many of the young men showing up to enlist were physically stunted, malnourished, and basically unfit for service because they had spent their lives shivering in damp, poorly heated tenements. This sparked a genuine panic among the ruling class. They realized that if they wanted to maintain a global empire, they couldn't have a domestic population that was freezing to death or living in perpetual dampness. By the time the Liberals took power in the landslide election of 1906, led by figures like Henry Campbell Bannerman and later Asquith, with a young, energetic David Lloyd George snapping at their heels, the winter problem became a matter of national security. They started looking at poverty not just as a moral failing, but as a systemic failure of infrastructure. If the winter was coming and the poor couldn't afford coal, the country would grind to a halt. This led to the birth of the modern welfare state, with the introduction of old age pensions and labor exchanges. But even with these reforms, the individual battle against the cold was something that happened on a very personal, very granular level. Now, here's the thing about Edwardian houses. Whether you were in a sprawling manor or a cramped terrace house, they were essentially designed to be wind tunnels. The architectural philosophy of the time hadn't quite caught up to the idea of insulation. Its walls were often solid brick without a cavity, which meant they acted like giant sponges for the British rain. Once that moisture got into the brickwork, the winter frost would hit, and the cold would just migrate straight through to the interior. Windows were single-pane glass, usually drafty, and high ceilings, while great for looking impressive, meant that all the heat you did manage to generate immediately escaped to a part of the room where you weren't actually standing. Let's start with the absolute centerpiece of Edwardian winter survival, the coal fire. In our modern world, we flick a thermostat or click a button on an app, and invisible warmth fills the room. For an Edwardian, warmth was a physical object you had to buy, carry, and manage. Coal was the lifeblood of the era. It was the primary source of heat, the fuel for cooking, and the driver of the economy. But coal was also filthy, expensive, and incredibly labor-intensive. If you were wealthy, you didn't see the labor. You just had a fleet of servants who would wake up at 5 a.m. in a freezing house to rake out the dead cinders from the night before, carry heavy scuttles of fresh coal up several flights of stairs, and get the fires roaring before you even opened your eyes. But if you were part of the working class, which most people were, the coal fire was a demanding, fickle god that ruled your life. The parlor fire was often only lit on Sundays or for special occasions because coal was so precious. During the week, the entire family would huddle in the kitchen around the range. The kitchen range was a massive, cast-iron beast that served as the heart of the home. It had a firebox in the middle. It had an oven on one side and a water boiler on the other. It was the only place in the house that was consistently warm, which meant that privacy, as we understand it, basically didn't exist in the winter. You lived, ate, worked, and sometimes even bathed in that one room because the rest of the house was effectively an icebox. One of the key technological developments that actually made these winters survivable for the middle class was the refinement of the closed-range stove. Unlike an open fireplace, which sucks about 90% of its heat straight up the chimney, a closed range allowed for much better control of the combustion. You could damp down the fire at night so it would smolder for hours, and you could use the residual heat of the iron to keep a kettle simmering. But even with a good stove, the sheer volume of coal needed was staggering. A typical Edwardian household might go through several tons of coal a year. This created a massive logistical nightmare every winter. You'd have coal merchants with horse-drawn carts rattling through the streets, their faces permanently stained with black dust, shouting their prices. If a strike happened, and the Edwardian era was a time of massive labor unrest, including the Great Unrest of 1911, the price of coal would skyrocket. And for a family on the edge of subsistence, that meant choosing between a hot meal or a warm room. The political leaders of the day were obsessed with the coal question. Men like Winston Churchill, who was then a rising star in the Liberal Party and serving as president of the Board of Trade, had to navigate the intense tensions between the powerful coal mine owners and the increasingly organized miners' unions. When the miners went on strike for a minimum wage in 1912, it wasn't just an economic issue. It was a survival issue. The government knew that without coal, the British winter would become a literal killer. This led to the Coal Mines Minimum Wage Act, a landmark piece of legislation that showed just how much the boring logistics of heating were driving the highest levels of British policy. But let's look at what happened when you actually had to leave the tiny circle of warmth provided by the fire. This is where Edwardian clothing comes in, and this is where the boring details of fabric and layering become a matter of life and death. And we see pictures of Edwardian ladies in their delicate silk dresses and think they must have been freezing. The secret was what was happening underneath. The Edwardian era was the golden age of wool. Underneath those stylish exteriors, people were encased in layers of flannel, wool, and heavy cotton. For a woman, the winter ensemble started with a chemise, followed by a corset, which actually acted as a decent windbreaker for the torso, and then the indispensable combinations, a one-piece undergarment that covered you from neck to ankles. On top of that, you'd have multiple petticoats. In the winter, at least one of these would be made of heavy red flannel. There was a common belief at the time that red flannel was warmer than other colors, a bit of Victorian pseudoscience that lingered into the Edwardian years. Well, then came the dress itself, often made of heavy wool serge or tweed. By the time an Edwardian woman was fully dressed for a winter walk, she was essentially wearing a suit of soft armor. She was carrying 10 to 15 pounds of clothing just to keep her core temperature from dropping. For men, the standard was the three-piece suit, but in winter, the fabrics were incredibly thick. We're talking about wool so dense it could practically stand up on its own. They wore heavy wool overcoats that reached down to their shins, lined with silk or fur if they could afford it. And everyone wore a hat. This wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a heat retention strategy. In an age before central heating, losing heat through the top of your head was a luxury no one could afford. If you were a laborer, you wore a flat cap made of wool, or if you were a clerk, a bowler, and if you were a gentleman, a top hat or a Homburg. The Edwardians also had a fascinating array of portable heating technologies. Since the rooms themselves were so cold, you had to bring the heat with you. This was the era of the stone hot water bottle. These weren't the floppy rubber ones we have today. They were heavy glazed ceramic jugs that you would fill with boiling water from the kitchen range. You'd wrap them in a piece of old flannel and shove them to the bottom of the bed an hour before you went to sleep. The boring reality of an Edwardian bedroom in January was that the air was often cold enough to see your breath, so the bed was a fortified bunker of blankets and stone bottles. If you were trained by train, which was the primary way people moved around, you'd have to deal with the foot warmer. These were long, flat metal canisters filled with sodium acetate, which stayed warm for hours. You'd hire them at the station and rest your boots on them during the journey, praying the carriage didn't have too many gaps in the floorboards. But what about the health implications of all this? The Edwardian winter wasn't just cold, it was dark. and incredibly smoky. Because every single house was burning coal and every factory was belching out soot, the cities were frequently choked by pea supers, thick yellow-black fogs that were actually a toxic mix of water vapor and sulfur dioxide. These fogs were so dense that you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. People would get lost on their own streets. Our link boys, essentially kids with torches, would sometimes be hired to lead people home, a throwback to the Middle Ages that persisted into the 20th century. Politically, this led to the first real stirrings of environmental regulation. There were groups like the Coal Smoke Abatement Society, which tried to lobby for cleaner burning stoves and industrial regulations. They argued that the winter fog was killing thousands of people through respiratory illnesses like bronchitis and pneumonia, often called the old man's friend, because it was such a frequent cause of death in the winter months. The leaders of the time, however, were hesitant to act. Coal was the engine of the empire's wealth, and any regulation that made coal more expensive or difficult to use was seen as an attack on British industry. So, for the duration of the Edwardian era, the solution to the winter fog was simply to wear a scarf over your mouth and hope for the best. Medical science during this period was in a weird transitional phase. You had the discovery of vitamins just on the horizon. Casimir Funk wouldn't coin the term until 1912, so the Edwardians didn't quite understand why people got sicker in the winter beyond the obvious cold and damp. They did, however, have a deep, almost religious belief in the power of fortifying the body. This is where the Edwardian winter diet comes in. If you look at the cookbooks of the time, like the ubiquitous Mrs. Beeton's, which was still the Bible of the Edwardian kitchen, the winter recipes are incredibly calorie-dense. We're talking about suet puddings, thick stews, porridges, and heavy meat pies. The idea was to build a layer of fat to insulate the body. And for the wealthy, this meant 10-course dinners featuring heavy sauces and roasted meats. For the poor, it meant bread and dripping, literally the leftover fat from a roast, spread on a slice of bread. This wasn't just about flavor, it was about survival. Fat was fuel. If your body was a furnace, you needed high-energy fuel to keep it running when the external temperature was hovering at 0 degrees. This is also why the Edwardians were obsessed with tonics. Every chemist's shop was stocked with various elixirs, many of them laden with cod liver oil, malt extract, or even significant amounts of alcohol and opium, all designed to keep the winter humors at bay. The political impact of this dietary need was massive. Britain in the Edwardian era was not self-sufficient when it came to food. It imported a huge percentage of its grain and meat from the colonies and the Americas. The winter months made these supply lines even more critical. If a winter storm delayed the refrigerated steamships bringing beef from Argentina or wheat from Canada, the prices in the London markets would spike immediately. This made the Edwardian government's commitment to free trade a massive point of political contention. The Conservatives, under Arthur Balfour and later Joseph Chamberlain, pushed for imperial preference, essentially putting tariffs on non-empire goods to protect British interests. The Liberals fought back, arguing that any tax on food, the dear loaf, would cause the working class to starve during the winter. This debate over Free trade versus protectionism dominated the elections of 1906 and 1910, and it was driven, and at its core, by the basic need to keep the population fed and fueled during the cold months. Let's talk about the specific winter of 1908 to 1909, which was particularly brutal and serves as a great example of how all these factors collided. The temperatures plummeted in late December and stayed low well into March. In London, the Thames didn't freeze over like it did in the Little Ice Age of the 1600s, but the slush and ice made the docks incredibly dangerous. For the thousands of casual laborers who worked the London docks, a frozen winter was a catastrophe. If the ships couldn't be unloaded, there was no work. No work meant no money for coal or food. This specific winter saw some of the largest right-to-work marches in British history. Thousands of unemployed men marched through the freezing streets of London and ending up in places like Trafalgar Square, demanding that the government provide relief. These weren't just political protests. They were desperate cries for heat and calories. It was during this winter that the Liberal government really felt the pressure to move faster on their social reforms. Herbert Asquith, who had just become Prime Minister, and David Lloyd George as Chancellor of the Exchequer, realized that the old poor law system, which essentially relied on the dreaded workhouse, was totally inadequate for a modern industrial crisis. This pressure culminated in the People's Budget of 1909. This was a revolutionary document that proposed taxing the wealthy and the landowners to pay for social welfare programs, including the new old age pensions. The budget was so controversial that it triggered a constitutional crisis. With the House of Lords, composed of the very landowners being taxed, rejecting it. This led to two general elections in 1910 and eventually the Parliament Act of 1911, which stripped the lords of their power to veto money bills. All of this, the fundamental reshaping of British democracy, was catalyzed by the reality of poor people shivering in the winter of 1908. While the politicians were arguing in the warmth of Westminster, the common people were finding incredibly creative, boring ways to survive. One of my favorite examples is the use of newspaper. It was discovered that a few layers of the Daily Mail or the Times tucked between your waistcoat and your shirt was an incredible insulator. It was cheap, windproof, and readily available. Homeless people, who were numerous in Edwardian London, would stuff their clothes with newspaper to create air pockets that trapped body heat. Even in middle-class homes, it wasn't uncommon to put layers of brown paper under the rugs to stop the drafts coming up through the floorboards. Then there was the issue of water. In an Edwardian winter, the pipes, which were often tacked onto the outside of the house because it was easier than burying them deep in the brickwork, would freeze solid. This meant no running water for cooking or cleaning. You'd have to melt snow or trek to the nearest public pump, which might also be frozen. The boring task of wrapping pipes in old rags and straw became a standard November ritual for every householder. If you failed, and the pipe burst, you didn't just have a leak. You had a flooded, freezing house that would take weeks to dry out in the damp British air. The Edwardian winter also dictated the social calendar in ways we don't often think about. The London season, that whirlwind of balls and parties, was a springtime and summer affair. In the winter, the aristocracy retreated to their country estates, but don't imagine these estates were cozy. A 50-room manor house was impossible to heat effectively. Even with dozens of fires going, the hallways were often as cold as the outdoors. This led to the development of specific winter rooms, smaller, more manageable spaces with lower ceilings where the family would congregate to conserve heat. They would close off entire wings of the house, draping the furniture in dust sheets, which also helped trap a bit of air, and essentially hibernating in a few select rooms. This hibernation extended to their fashion as well, indoors, as people wore house coats and dressing gowns that were essentially wearable blankets. These weren't the thin silk robes of the movies. They were heavy, quilted garments, often lined with flannel or wool. For a gentleman, a smoking jacket served a dual purpose. It protected his clothes from the smell of tobacco, but more importantly, it was an extra layer of velvet and silk that kept him warm while he sat in his library. In the southwest and the north of England, where the winters could be even harsher due to the elevation or the sea winds, the survival techniques were even more rugged. In the mining villages of Wales or Durham, the boring reality was that the fireplace was never allowed to go out. The fire was banked up with slack, fine coal dust mixed with water, which would burn slowly and steadily for days. At the kitchen range was the literal sun of the household, around which everything orbited. Children would do their homework by the glow of the firebox, and clothes would be hung on maidens, wooden drying racks, nearby, filling the air with the smell of damp wool and coal smoke. One of the most overlooked aspects of Edwardian winter survival was the role of the local pub. For a working-class man, the pub wasn't just a place to get a pint. It was a communal heating station. For the price of a single beer, you could sit by a large, professionally maintained fire for hours. In the winter, pubs were often the only truly warm places in the entire neighborhood. This led to a lot of tension with the growing temperance movement, which was a huge political force at the time. Temperance advocates, many of them middle-class liberals, wanted to close the pubs or limit their hours. But for a man living in a freezing, damp room, the pub was a physiological necessity. The beer versus warmth debate was a real thing, and it forced the government to consider the social function of these spaces beyond just alcohol consumption. In the world of technology, the Edwardians were starting to experiment with gas heating, but it was still in its infancy. Gas fires were seen as slightly dangerous and prone to giving off fumes. They were often installed in bedrooms where you only needed a quick burst of heat while dressing. But the idea of gas as a primary heating source was still a decade or more away for most people. Electricity was even rarer, a luxury for the ultra-wealthy in the fashionable districts of London like Mayfair. For everyone else, the Edwardian winter was a 19th century experience lived in a 20th century world. The military was also grappling with the winter. The British Army, which was being reorganized by Richard Haldane, the Secretary of State for War, into the British Expeditionary Force, spent a lot of time thinking about how to keep soldiers functional in the cold. They developed the greatcoat, a heavy wool coat that would become iconic in the trenches a few years later. They also experimented with portable Tommy cookers, small alcohol-fueled stoves, and researched the caloric needs of men in cold climates. This boring logistical research would eventually save lives during the Great War, but it started as a response to the miserable winters of the Edwardian home front. Even the king himself wasn't immune to the winter's grip. Edward VII suffered from chronic bronchitis, which was exacerbated by the damp London winters and his heavy smoking. His doctors frequently ordered him to the south of France or Biarritz for the winter cure. This flight to the sun became a trend for the British elite, fueling the development of the French Riviera as a winter playground. But for the politicians left behind, the king's absence created its own set of problems. Important state papers had to be sent by courier to the Mediterranean, and decisions were often delayed. The king's health was a matter of state, and that health was directly tied to the thermometer. As we look at the year 1910, the end of the official Edwardian era, we see a country that had been fundamentally changed by its struggle with the environment. The boring needs of the winter, the need for coal, and the need for calories, the need for warm housing, had shifted the entire political landscape. The liberal reforms had started to create a safety net, however thin, that recognized the state's responsibility in keeping its citizens from freezing. The Labor Party was also on the rise, born out of the trade unions that fought for the rights of the men who dug the coal and worked the docks. The winter of 1910 itself was a time of political firestorms. Following the death of Edward VII in May, the country was plunged into mourning just as a new constitutional battle was brewing. The new king, George V, was immediately faced with the crisis of the House of Lords. Throughout the cold months of late 1910, as the second general election of the year took place, the candidates had to stump in the freezing rain and sleet. The political meetings were held in drafty town halls where the breath of the speakers would mist in the air. The boring logistics of a winter election, how to get voters to the polls in the snow, how to keep the campaign trains running, determined the narrow margin of the liberal victory. The Edwardian winter was a season of endurance. It was a time when the physical limits of the human body were tested every day by the simple absence of heat. It was a world of red flannel, stone bottles, and the constant rhythmic sound of a coal shovel hitting the bottom of a scuttle. It was a world where a pea-souper fog could shut down the greatest city on earth, and where the price of a ton of coal could determine the fate of a government. And while we remember the period for its elegance and its garden parties, the reality was much grittier, much damper, and much colder. But the Edwardians were nothing if not resourceful. They found ways to turn their boring survival tactics into a high art. They perfected the cozy interior, the nook by the fire, and the ritual of afternoon tea, which, let's be honest, was mostly a way to get a hot liquid into your system and sit near a kettle. They turned their heavy woolens into a fashion statement and their hearty winter stews into a culinary tradition. They were a generation that lived through the transition from the old world to the new, and they did it while wearing 3 layers of wool and carrying a hot brick wrapped in a towel. By the time the winter of 1913 rolled around, the last true Edwardian winter before the world changed forever, the infrastructure of survival was at its peak. The coal supply chains were more efficient than ever. The welfare reforms were starting to take some of the sting out of the season for the poorest, and the technology of the home was slowly, ever so slowly, starting to modernize. But the fundamental challenge remained the same. You still had to fight for every degree of warmth. You still had to rake the cinders and haul the ash. You still had to hope the pipes wouldn't burst and the fog wouldn't settle. I want to talk more about the specific technologies that were emerging at the very end of this period, the ones that teased a future where winter wouldn't be such a struggle, things like the early vacuum flasks, which allowed a workman to take hot tea to a freezing job site, or the first experiments with radiator systems in middle-class homes. These were the high-tech gadgets of 1912, and they were seen with a mix of wonder and skepticism. There was also the fascinating political movement of smoke abatement, where scientists and activists were actually trying to map the flow of soot over London to prove that the fog was a man-made disaster. This was the birth of urban environmentalism, and it was driven by the miserable experience of Edwardian winters. But even with those advancements, the social divide remained the most defining feature of the season. If you were a servant in a great house, your winter was defined by the transition between the freezing below stairs and the overheated above stairs. You'd spend your day moving between the two, your body constantly adjusting to 20-degree temperature swings. You'd have chilblains on your fingers, painful, itchy swellings caused by the cold and damp that you'd try to treat with everything from vinegar to onion juice. For the people upstairs, the winter was a sequence of changing outfits and moving from one fireplace to another. For the people downstairs, it was a sequence of heavy lifting and endless cleaning of the very coal dust that kept the house alive. The Edwardian era ended not with a whimper, but with the roar of a different kind of fire in 1914. But the lessons learned in those boring winters, the importance of coal, the necessity of a healthy and warm population, the logistical brilliance required to keep a cold country running, would become the backbone of the war effort. The same coal that heated the Edwardian parlor would power the dreadnoughts of the Royal Navy. The same red flannel that kept a grandmother warm would be turned into bandages and liners for the troops. When we look back at those years, it's easy to get caught up in the romance of the era. But the next time you see a picture of an Edwardian gentleman in his fine suit or a lady in her elegant gown, I want you to look at the background. Look for the coal smoke in the air, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the drafts, and the thick layers of fabric that tell the real story. Because the Edwardian era wasn't just a time of peace and prosperity, it was a time of a relentless, daily battle against the cold. And the way they fought that battle, with policy, with technology, and with sheer, stubborn endurance, is a story that's anything but boring. I think about the politicians of that time, men like Lloyd George, who had grown up in a cottage in Wales, knowing exactly what it meant to have a cold house. That personal experience fueled his political drive. He didn't just want to pass reforms. He wanted to ensure that the boring basics of life, warmth, food, and security, were available to more than just the elite. This was the era where the right to warmth started to become an unwritten part of the social contract. It's a legacy we still live with today, even if we've forgotten the coal dust and the stone water bottles that started it all. Let's dive deeper into the mechanics of the Edwardian home, specifically the back kitchen and the scullery, because that's where the real winter war was won or lost. In a typical middle-class house, the scullery was a separate room, often unheated, where all the wet work happened. In the winter, this room was a nightmare. The stone floor would be ice cold, and the water in the sink would often have a layer of ice on it in the morning. This was where the laundry was done, a task that in the Edwardian winter was nothing short of heroic. You had to boil massive pots of water on the range, scrub heavy woolens by hand, and then try to dry them. Drying clothes in the winter was a week-long process. You couldn't hang them outside because they'd just freeze into cardboard shapes, so they had to be draped all over the kitchen and living areas, creating a constant state of humid dampness that made the cold feel even more piercing. The smell of an Edwardian house in winter would have been unmistakable. It was a combination of coal smoke, damp wool, boiling cabbage, and the faint, a sweet scent of the winter greens that were the only vegetables available. It was a sensory experience that defined an entire generation, and it was an experience that was shared in varying degrees of intensity by everyone from the highest lord to the lowest laborer. The winter was the great equalizer, a reminder that despite the vast differences in wealth and status, everyone was ultimately at the mercy of the British weather. The political leaders of the era were also struggling with the boring reality of the winter. During the winter months, the House of Commons was a notoriously difficult place to work. Despite being a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture, it was drafty and notoriously hard to heat. Members would sit on the benches wrapped in heavy overcoats, and the air was often thick with the smell of the very coal smoke they were trying to regulate. This physical environment shaped the debates. When they talked about the distress of the unemployed or the hardships of the poor, they weren't talking about abstract concepts. They were talking about things they could feel in their own bones as they sat in the cold halls of power. This connection between the physical experience of the winter and the political action of the day is something we often overlook. We think of history as a series of grand ideas and dramatic events, but it's often driven by the boring things, like whether a room is warm enough to think in or whether a person has enough calories to walk to work. The Edwardian era was a perfect example of this. It was a decade where the boring struggle for warmth led to a fundamental restructuring of British society. The welfare state wasn't just a grand ideological project. It was a practical response to the brutal reality of the winter. Think about the sheer amount of planning that went into just surviving a single week. In January 1905, you had to ensure the coal delivery was scheduled and paid for. You had to manage the fire so it didn't go out, but didn't burn through your supply too fast. You had to plan meals that were high in fat and easy to cook on a single heat source. You had to layer your clothes in a specific order to maximize insulation. You had to wrap the pipes, salt the doorstep, and prep the hot water bottles. It was a full-time job, mostly performed by women. And that left very little time for the elegant leisure we associate with the period. For the Edwardian working class, the winter was a time of making do. This was the era of the pawn shop winter. Families would pawn their better clothes or furniture in the summer to buy food and then desperately try to get them back in the winter when they needed the warmth. Or, more commonly, they'd pawn their summer gear to buy coal. The pawnbroker's shop was a vital part of the winter economy, a boring but essential financial institution that kept people from the brink. The politicians knew this, and it's why the regulation of pawnbrokers and the provision of low-interest credit became a minor but significant political issue. I also want to look at the role of the Edwardian church in the winter. In many communities, the church was more than just a place of worship. It was a center of winter relief. This was the era of the coal and clothing clubs, where parishioners would pay in a few pennies a week during the summer, and the church would use the bulk buying power to provide coal and warm clothes in the winter. This was social security before the state took over the job. The political transition from charity to rights was one of the biggest shifts of the Edwardian era, and it was fought over in the context of these winter relief programs. The liberals argued that the deserving poor shouldn't have to rely on the whims of a local vicar for their winter warmth. They argued that a man who had worked all his life should have a pension as a right, not a gift. This was a radical idea at the time, and it was deeply tied to the physical reality of the winter. A pension was, at its heart, a guarantee that you could afford a fire in your old age. When the first pensions were paid out in 1909, 5 shillings a week for those over 70, the stories from the post offices were heartbreaking. People weren't buying luxuries. They were buying coal and tea. They were buying warmth. The Edwardian winter also saw a rise in rational architecture. Toward the end of the period, we see the influence of the arts and crafts movement, led by figures like William Morris and later architects like Edwin Lutyens. They started to design houses that were not just beautiful, but more functional. They focused on honest materials, better-fitting windows, and the placement of fireplaces to maximize heat distribution. They were trying to solve the boring problems of the Victorian house through better design. While this was mostly for the wealthy, the ideas started to trickle down into the design of model villages for workers, like Bourneville in Birmingham or Port Sunlight on the Wirral. These were the first attempts to build houses for common people that weren't inherently damp and freezing. The politics of these model villages were fascinating. They were often built by Quaker industrialists like the Cadburys or the Levers, who believed that a warm, dry worker was a more productive and moral worker. This was paternalistic capitalism, and it was a direct competitor to the growing socialist movement. The socialists, meanwhile, were arguing that the government should be building these houses, not just kind employers. The debate over council housing began in earnest during the Edwardian years, fueled by the miserable conditions of the slums during the winter. Even the way Edwardians thought about the outdoors was changing. This was the era of the fresh air cure. Despite the cold, there was a growing movement, especially for those with tuberculosis, that believed cold, fresh air was better than the stagnant, smoky air of a heated room. This led to the creation of open-air schools and sanatoriums where patients would sleep on porches in the middle of winter, wrapped in dozens of blankets. The boring logistics of how to keep someone warm while they were technically outside led to some incredibly sophisticated blanket and sleeping bag designs. This paradox, the desperate need for warmth versus the belief in the healing power of cold air, was a uniquely Edwardian tension. As we move through this story, I want you to keep in mind that the Edwardian era was the last gasp of a world that was still powered by human muscle and coal. It was a world that was incredibly vulnerable to the seasons. When the sun went down at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday in December, the entire pace of life changed. The boring tasks of lighting lamps, another massive job involving trimming wicks and cleaning glass chimneys, and banking fires became the focus of the evening. The social life of the era, the political debates, and the economic shifts were all happening within this framework of seasonal survival. The political leaders of the day, Asquith, Lloyd George, Churchill, Balfour were all products of this environment. They were men who understood the power of the cold. They knew that a winter without coal was a winter of revolution. They had seen the marches, they had felt the pea-soup fogs, and they had read the mortality statistics. Their boring work of drafting budgets, negotiating with unions, and reforming the tax code was, in a very real sense, a war against the winter. They were trying to build a Britain that was robust enough to survive the frost, both literal and metaphorical. In the next part, I want to get into the specific details of the Edwardian kitchen, the engine room of the winter. We'll look at the chemistry of suet, the physics of the cast iron range, and the boring but brilliant way they managed to keep food from spoiling without refrigeration. We'll also look at the rise of the department store, places like Selfridges, which opened in 1909, and how they turned winter survival into a retail experience. But for now, just imagine that Edwardian house on a cold January night. The smell of the coal, the weight of the blankets, the flicker of the gaslight, and the quiet, constant struggle to keep the cold at bay. It was a world that was about to disappear. But for those living in it, the only thing that mattered was making it through to the spring. One of the most interesting political anecdotes of the time involves David Lloyd George and his Budget League. To promote the people's budget, he didn't just give speeches in London. He sent speakers out into the freezing country villages. They would set up in market squares, often in the snow, and explain to the local laborers how the new taxes on the Duke's land would eventually pay for their own pensions and medical care. The image of these men, shivering in their wool coats, arguing about land value tax, while the locals huddled around braziers, is a perfect snapshot of Edwardian politics. It was a grassroots struggle fought in the coldest months of the year, because that was when the need for change was most obvious. The opposition, the Budget Protest League, was equally active. They argued that the new taxes would ruin the great estates, which were the primary employers in many rural areas. They warned that if the dukes were taxed too heavily, they wouldn't be able to afford the winter charities that kept the villages going. This was a battle between two different visions of survival, the old way of private charity and noble obligation, and the new way of state-mandated rights and social insurance. And the cold, hard winter was the backdrop that made the stakes feel real for everyone involved. As the Edwardian era drew to a close, the boring reality of the winter had become a catalyst for a new kind of Britain. The country was more divided than ever, but it was also more aware of its own vulnerabilities. The struggle to stay warm had forced a conversation about what it meant to be a citizen and what the state owed to its people. It had driven technological innovation in the home and political innovation in Westminster. It was a decade of intense, quiet preparation, a layering of fabric and a layering of policy that would be put to the ultimate test in the years to come. I also find it fascinating to look at the boring world of Edwardian insurance. This was the era when industrial insurance took off. These were tiny policies, often just a few pennies a week, that were primarily intended to cover the cost of a funeral. Why was this so important in winter? Because the winter death rate was so high. A decent burial was an obsession for the Edwardian working class, and the insurance man who came round to collect the pennies was a staple of the winter streets. The boring math of mortality and the fear of a pauper's grave were part of the psychological landscape of the season. When the Liberals introduced the National Insurance Act in 1911, it was a direct strike at this fear, providing sickness and unemployment benefits that helped families stay out of the pawn shop and away from the insurance man's dreaded tally. The Edwardian winter was a time of deep structural change disguised as a series of small daily struggles. It was a time when the boring details of coal prices and wool weights were the most important things in the world. It was a time when the physical environment forced a nation to look at itself and ask if it could do better. And as we look back from our world of central heating and instant everything, there's something genuinely impressive about the way they handled it. They didn't just survive the winter, they built the foundation of the modern world in the middle of it. Think about the sheer physical effort of an Edwardian commute in February. If you were a clerk living in one of the new streetcar suburbs, you'd walk to the tram stop in the dark. The tram itself would be unheated, with just some straw on the floor to soak up the melting snow from people's boots. You'd sit there, shivering in your wool suit, your breath fogging the windows, until you reached the city center. Then another walk through the slush to a cold office, where the only heat might be a single small fireplace shared by 20 people. You'd work all day in fingerless gloves, and then do the whole journey in reverse, arriving home to a house that was only warm in one room. This was the boring reality for the millions of people who made the Edwardian economy run. The resilience required for that daily grind is something we rarely talk about. We talk about the grandeur of the era. But the grandeur was the exception. The rule was a cold, damp, and smoky endurance. And the politics of the era, the rise of the Labor Party, the radicalization of the liberals, the desperate cling of the conservatives to the old ways, were all reflections of that endurance. The people wanted more than just to survive. They wanted a life where the winter wasn't a constant threat to their health and their dignity. In the libraries and clubs of the elite, the conversation might have been about the Irish question or the naval arms race with Germany, but in the kitchens and pubs, the conversation was about the coal question and the housing question. And eventually, the two worlds had to meet. The Edwardian era was the moment of that meeting. It was the decade where the boring problems of the domestic sphere became the urgent problems of the political sphere. It was the decade where the winter finally forced the hand of the empire. I want to spend some time looking at the specific winter of 1911 to 1912 because that was a turning point for many of these issues. Not only was it a cold winter, but it was also the winter of the Great Coal Strike. For several weeks in early 1912, the nation's coal supply effectively stopped. This was the first time the entire country realized just how dependent they were on the men in the pits. Without coal, the trains stopped. Without trains, the food supply failed. Without food and heat, the cities became tinderboxes of potential unrest. This strike did more to change the political consciousness of Britain than 100 speeches in Parliament. It was a boring industrial dispute that became a national existential crisis because it happened in the middle of winter. The government's response to the strike was a mix of panic and pragmatic innovation. They realized they couldn't just use the army to force the miners back. There were too many of them, and the public was too sympathetic to their demand for a minimum wage. So the government stepped in to mediate in a way they never had before. This was the beginning of the tripartite system of labor relations, where the state, the employers, and the unions all had a seat at the table. This boring administrative change was a direct result of the cold houses and empty fireplaces of 1912. The Edwardians were also the first to really quantify the winter. This was the era of the social surveyor, like Charles Booth or Seabohm Rowntree. They went into the slums and actually measured the boring details of poverty. They counted the number of blankets on a bed, the amount of coal in a grate, and the number of calories in a meal. Their reports, massive, multi-volume sets of data, provided the scientific basis for the liberal reforms. They proved that poverty wasn't a moral failing, but a mathematical reality. They showed that during the winter, a family's income simply couldn't cover the increased cost of heat and food. This boring data was the weapon the liberals used to beat back the opposition in the House of Lords. The social surveyors also looked at the impact of the winter on children. They found that kids in the cities actually stopped growing during the winter months because all their energy was going into staying warm. This led to the introduction of free school meals in 1906, one of the first great liberal reforms. The idea was that the state had a vested interest in the physical efficiency of its future citizens. If the parents couldn't afford to feed their children during the winter, the state would step in. This was a boring administrative change that had a profound impact on the health of the nation, and it was driven by the reality of the thermometer. As we look at the winter of 1913, the last one before the war, we see a Britain that was more organized, more regulated, and more social than it had been at the start of the century. The boring work of the previous decade had created a society that was better equipped to handle the cold. There were more clinics, more school meals, more pensions, and more labor regulations. The individual still had to rake the cinders and haul the coal, but they were no longer doing it in total isolation. They were part of a state that had finally begun to acknowledge that the winter was a collective problem. And then, of course, everything changed. But the boring history of the Edwardian winter gives us a different lens through which to see the era. It's not just a story of hats and garden parties. It's a story of coal and wool and the birth of the modern welfare state. It's a story of how a society coped with its most basic needs and how those needs drove it toward a more equitable and organized future. It's a story of endurance, innovation, and the quiet, persistent struggle to keep the home fires burning. I want to mention one more thing before we move on to the next section, and that's the Edwardian obsession with coziness. Because the world outside was so cold and harsh, the world inside became incredibly cluttered and padded. This was the era of the overstuffed armchair, the heavy velvet drapes, and the rooms filled with knickknacks. We often think of Edwardian decor as being a bit much, but it was a psychological defense against the winter. A room filled with things felt warmer. A thick rug and heavy curtains weren't just for show, they were literal barriers against the frost. The boring world of interior design was another front in the war against the winter. The Edwardians were masters of creating these little pockets of warmth and light in a dark, cold world. Whether it was the glow of a kitchen range, the warmth of a red flannel petticoat, or the security of a 5-shilling pension, they found ways to make the winter survivable. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. They moved Britain from the 19th century world of every man for himself to the 20th century world of collective responsibility. And they did it all while shivering. In the next part of this script, we're going to dive into the specifics of the Edwardian winter diet. We'll talk about the suet puddings that kept the working class moving, the elaborate game dinners of the aristocracy, and the boring but vital science of food preservation before the refrigerator. We'll also look at how the global trade networks of the British Empire were essentially one big calorie delivery system for the winter months. But before we get there, let's take one more look at the Edwardian street. The sun is setting, the coal carts are making their last rounds, the lamplighter is starting his work, and in every house, someone is kneeling down to rake out the cinders and start the fire that will get them through another night. The political world was also adjusting to a new reality. The Parliament Act of 1911 had fundamentally changed the power structure, and the Liberal government was pushing forward with even more radical ideas like Home Rule for Ireland and even the first whispers of a national health service. But all of these grand political movements were happening against the backdrop of the boring daily life of the citizens. A politician could give the most brilliant speech in the world about the future of the empire. But if the voters' house was freezing and their children were hungry, the speech didn't matter. The Edwardian leaders who understood this, men like Lloyd George, were the ones who truly shaped the era. They understood that the boring things were the most important things. They understood that a nation is only as strong as its warmest room. And so, they focused on the coal, the pensions, and the housing. They focused on the things that mattered when the temperature dropped. They focused on the winter. And in doing so, they created a legacy that is still visible in the way we think about the state and the individual today. As we think about these Edwardians, don't just see them as characters in a costume drama. See them as people who were very much like us, but without the benefit of our technology. See them as people who had to be incredibly smart and incredibly tough just to stay comfortable. See them as the architects of a modern world that was built, one scuttle of coal at a time, in the middle of a cold British winter. The story of how they survived isn't just a story of technology. It's a story of policy, of culture, and of the human spirit. It's a story that reminds us that even the most boring things, like the way we heat our homes or the fabric of our clothes, are deeply tied to the grand movements of history. The Edwardian winter was a challenge that forced a nation to grow up, to organize, and to care for its own. And that, I think, is a story worth telling. I want to touch on the boring world of Edwardian laundry one more time, because it really highlights the physical toll of the winter. Imagine it's a Tuesday in February. You've been hauling coal all morning to keep the range going. Now, you have to deal with the laundry. You don't have a washing machine. You have a copper, a large built-in vat that you have to fill with water and then heat with another fire underneath. You spend hours stirring the heavy, wet clothes with a wooden dolly or pozzer. Then you have to run everything through a hand-cranked mangle, two heavy rollers that squeeze out the water. In the winter, the dampness of the clothes makes your hands raw and red. Then you have to find space to hang it all up inside. the house becomes a forest of wet sheets and steaming wool. It's this boring task took up an entire day and left everyone in the house feeling the dampness in their lungs. But this dampness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a political issue. The sanitary movement, which had started in the Victorian era but reached its peak in the Edwardian years, argued that damp housing was the primary cause of the national physical deterioration. They pushed for new building codes that required damp-proof courses, a layer of slate or bitumen in the walls to stop moisture from rising. This boring architectural detail was one of the most important health interventions of the century. It was a political fight against the slumlords who didn't want the extra expense. Again, the struggle for a dry, warm home was a struggle for political reform. And what about the lighting? In the winter, you were using artificial light for 16 hours a day. This meant more coal was being used at the gasworks and more soot was being released into the air. The boring transition from candles to gaslight and then to the early electric glow lamps changed the ways people spent their winter evenings. It allowed for more reading, more study, and more political organizing. The Workers' Educational Association, founded in 1903, flourished during the winter months as people gathered in gaslit rooms to learn about economics and history. The winter wasn't just a time of hibernation. It was a time of intellectual growth, powered by the very coal that warmed the rooms. The Edwardian winter was a complex interlocking system of fuel, fabric, food, and feelings. It was a time when the boring necessities of life were the most interesting things happening. It was a time when the way you stayed warm determined the way you thought about the world. And as we move into the specifics of the Edwardian kitchen and the boring science of their winter diet, I want you to keep that image of the kitchen range in your mind. It was the heart of the home, the engine of survival, and the center of the Edwardian world. The Edwardians were obsessed with efficiency, a word that pops up constantly in their political and social discourse. They wanted efficient factories, efficient soldiers, and efficient homes. In the winter, efficiency was the difference between comfort and misery. This drove them to experiment with new ways of managing the home. This was the era of the first home economics courses, where young women were taught the scientific way to manage a coal fire and prepare high-calorie meals. It was a boring attempt to professionalize the work of survival. This movement toward scientific management in the home was mirrored in the government. The Edwardian civil service was becoming more professional and more data-driven. They were creating efficiency committees to look at everything from the way the post office was run to the way the Navy was fueled, and always, in the background, was the coal. The coal mines were the most dangerous and inefficient part of the British economy, and the Edwardian struggle to reform them was a struggle to secure the country's future. The boring details of mine safety and mineral rights were the lifeblood of the nation's warmth, as even the way Edwardians entertained themselves in the winter was a form of heat management. The parlor games and the singing around the piano weren't just for fun. They were a way to keep a group of people in one room, sharing the warmth of a single fire. The boring social conventions of the time, the way you were expected to dress for dinner, the way you were expected to sit, were all designed to maintain a level of decorum in a world that was physically uncomfortable. They used manners as a layer of insulation, against the harshness of the season. The Edwardian winter was a season of deep contrasts. The bright glow of the fire against the dark, smoky fog. The thick, heavy wool against the delicate lace. The grand political debates against the boring daily struggle for coal. It was a time of immense change, and yet it was a time of intense tradition. It was the last period in history where a person's life was so fundamentally dictated by the turn of the seasons and the availability of a single fuel source. As we look at the year 1912, we see a world that was becoming more and more modern every day. The RMS Titanic, the ultimate symbol of Edwardian technological pride, was built in the freezing shipyards of Belfast, where the workers survived the winter on hot tea and bread and dripping. Its sinking in April 1912 was a shock that went beyond the loss of life. It was a blow to the idea that technology had finally conquered the elements. Even the greatest ship in the world was at the mercy of the cold. This sense of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of something larger than yourself, was a core part of the Edwardian winter experience. It was something that the politicians of the time tried to mitigate through policy, and something that the common people mitigated through technology and tradition. It was a shared experience that bonded a nation together, even as it was being pulled apart by the stresses of a changing world. In the final section of this part of the script, I want to look at the boring history of the Edwardian fireplace itself. Because the fireplace wasn't just a hole in the wall with some burning rocks in it. It was a highly evolved piece of technology. The Edwardians had developed specific types of grates for different types of coal. They had slop grates for burning low-quality slack and canopy grates that were supposed to reflect more heat into the room. They had trivets for keeping teapots warm and fender stools where you could rest your feet. The boring mechanics of how the smoke was drawn up the chimney and how the air was pulled in from the room were subjects of intense discussion in the popular science magazines of the day. Every fireplace was its own little ecosystem, and managing it was a skill that was passed down from generation to generation. You had to know when to poke the fire to let in more air, and when to bank it to keep it from burning out too fast. You had to know which way the wind was blowing, because a downdraft could fill your parlor with toxic smoke in seconds. This was a boring but vital form of literacy that everyone in the Edwardian era possessed. It was a knowledge of the elements that we have almost completely lost in the modern world. And it's that loss of knowledge that makes the Edwardian winter seem so fascinating to us today. We look at their lives and we see a level of complexity and effort that seems almost impossible. But for them, it was just the way life was. It was the boring reality of the season. And as we move into the next section, we'll see how that reality was reflected in the very food they ate, the calories that provided the internal heat to match the external fire. We'll look at the suet, the stew, and the science of the Edwardian winter diet, and we'll see how even a bowl of porridge was a political statement. The politics of food in the Edwardian winter were just as intense as the politics of coal. The free trade debates were really debates about the price of a loaf of bread in January. If the price of bread went up by a half-penny, as it was a catastrophe for a family on the edge of survival. The Liberal government's commitment to the cheap loaf was their most powerful political weapon. They would show posters comparing the liberal loaf, large and affordable, with the Tory loaf, small and expensive due to tariffs. This boring economic argument was the key to their electoral success. It was a politics of the stomach, and it was never more relevant than during the winter months. So, let's head into the kitchen. Let's look at the boring details of how a 1905 household managed its food supply. Let's talk about the larder, the pantry, and the scullery. Let's look at the calories that fueled an empire and the recipes that kept the cold at bay. Because the story of the Edwardian winter is a story of many things: politics, technology, and endurance. But it is also, what at its heart, a story of what happens when you sit down at the table and try to find a little bit of warmth in a cold, cold world. The kitchen of an Edwardian house was often located in the basement or at the very back of the house, away from the elegant living areas. This was done to keep the heat, the smells, and the boring labor of cooking out of sight. But in the winter, this arrangement created its own set of problems. The kitchen was the warmest room, but it was also the place where the dampness was most intense. The steam from the cooking and the laundry would condense on the cold stone walls, leading to a constant battle against mold and the damp. The boring daily task of wiping down the walls with a vinegar solution was just another part of the winter routine. And then there was the issue of the servants' quarters. If you were a maid in an Edwardian house, you lived in the attic. These rooms were the exact opposite of the kitchen. They were the coldest rooms in the house. In the winter, the water in your wash basin would freeze overnight. You'd wake up in the dark, put on your layers of wool, and head down to the kitchen to start the fires. Your entire day was a journey from the freezing attic to the hot kitchen and then into the drafty hallways. The boring logistics of your life were defined by these temperature gradients. The political realization that the physical deterioration of the working class was tied to these living conditions led to the first major housing acts of the era. These acts gave local councils the power to clear slums and build new, more efficient housing, but progress was slow. For most people, the Edwardian winter was still an experience of damp walls and cold attics. The boring history of the British Council House begins here in the cold winters of the 1900s as a response to the health crises of the time. One of the most interesting technological shifts in the Edwardian kitchen was the gradual introduction of branded foods. This was the era of the first breakfast cereals, the first canned soups, and the first ready-made sauces. For a middle-class housewife, these boring innovations were a godsend in the winter. They allowed for a quick, hot meal without the hours of labor required by traditional recipes. They were also reliable. You knew exactly what you were getting, which was important when the quality of fresh ingredients was so variable in the winter. The politics of food safety, driven by figures like the pure food activists, became a major issue, leading to the first regulations on what could and couldn't be put into these canned goods. As we look at the Edwardian diet, we also have to look at the boring world of the corner shop. This was the lifeline for the working-class family. In the winter, you didn't buy in bulk. You bought in tiny quantity: a pennyworth of tea, a single rasher of bacon, a handful of coal. This hand-to-mouth existence was incredibly inefficient and expensive, but it was the only way many people could manage their tiny incomes. The boring math of the corner shop was the math of survival. When the liberals introduced the labor exchanges and the first unemployment insurance, they were trying to break this cycle of hand-to-mouth living. Hey, I want to talk about the concept of wintering as a psychological state for the Edwardians. Because the season was so long and so physically demanding, there was a sense of hunkering down that permeated everything. You see it in the literature of the time, the way authors like E.M. Forster or D.H. Lawrence describe the interior spaces and the feeling of being shut in by the weather. There was a quiet intensity to Edwardian winter life, a focus on the small details of the home and the family. It was a time of boring domesticity that was actually a form of deep emotional resilience. The political world was also shut in during the winter. Parliament usually met from February to August, which meant the most intense political battles happened as the country was moving from the tail end of winter into the spring. The opening of Parliament in February was a major social and political event, a signal that the long, dark winter was finally coming to an end. The king would ride through the streets in his gold coach, and the people would line the freezing sidewalks to catch a glimpse of him. It was a ritual of renewal, a promise that the empire was still strong and that the spring was on its way. But even as the spring arrived, the boring work of the winter continued. The coal grates had to be cleaned, the chimneys swept, the woolen stored away in mothballs, and the repairs to the damp, damaged walls begun. The Edwardian winter wasn't just a season. It was a cycle of preparation, endurance, and recovery. It was a cycle that dictated the rhythm of life for an entire nation. And I think the most important thing to remember about the Edwardian winter is that it was a time of quiet revolution. While the newspapers were full of the big stories, the suffragettes, the dreadnoughts, the crisis in the Balkans, the real history was happening in the kitchens and the coal sheds. It was a history of people finding new ways to survive, of politicians finding new ways to govern, and of a society finding new ways to care for itself. It was a history that was boring only if you weren't the one shivering in the cold. As we look at the Edwardian period, we should see it not as a museum piece, but as a living, breathing, shivering moment in time. We should see the people not as flat characters in a photo, but as men and women who were grappling with the same basic needs we have today. Yeah, but under much more difficult circumstances, we should see their boring struggles as the foundation of our own comfort. Because every time we turn on a heater or open a fridge, we are enjoying the fruits of a battle that was won by the Edwardians during those long, dark winters at the start of the 20th century. I want to spend a moment on the boring history of the Edwardian blanket. We think of a blanket as a simple thing, but for an Edwardian, there was a whole hierarchy of blankets. You had your Whitney blankets, made in Oxfordshire, which were the gold standard of wool. They were thick, heavy, and had a nap that was specifically designed to trap air. Then you had your shoddy blankets, made from recycled wool and cotton, which were cheaper, but much less effective. It's the politics of the wool trade, the boring details of imports from Australia and New Zealand, determined whether a family in Manchester could afford a Whitney or had to settle for a shoddy. Even the way a bed was made in the winter was a boring but essential skill. You didn't just throw a blanket on, you had to layer them in a specific order. with the heaviest at the top to weigh down the others and prevent drafts. You'd often put a quilt or an eiderdown on top of that. And if you were really cold, you'd put your overcoat on top of the whole pile. The boring reality of the Edwardian bedroom was that you were often sleeping under 20 or 30 pounds of fabric. It was a physical weight that stayed with you all night, a reminder of the battle you were fighting even while you slept. And what about the morning? Now, waking up in an Edwardian house in the winter was a test of character. The air was freezing, the floor was ice cold, and the fire in the grate was long dead. You had to move fast, grab your clothes, which you'd hopefully tucked under the blankets with you to keep them warm, and head for the one room where the fire was being started. This boring morning ritual was the start of every day for millions of people. It was a moment of peak vulnerability, and the way people handled it, with a cup of hot tea and a stoic attitude, was the essence of the Edwardian spirit. The political world was also waking up to a new reality during these years. The old certainties were gone. The boring work of the previous decade had created a new kind of citizen, one who expected more from the state and was more organized in their demands. The winter had played its part in this transformation. It had shown the limits of charity and the necessity of rights. It had shown the power of the coal miners and the vulnerability of the empire. It had shown that the most boring things, heat, food, and housing, were the most political things of all. As we move into the next part of this script, we'll look at the specific winter foods, the suet, the porridge, and the tea, and how they were part of this larger story. We'll look at the boring chemistry of the Edwardian diet and the boring economics of the global food trade. And we'll see how even the most simple meal was a part of the grand, boring history of survival. The Edwardian era was a time when the world was changing fast, but the winter was the one thing that remained constant. It was the anchor that kept the country grounded in the reality of the physical world. It was the challenge that forced everyone to be a little bit smarter, a little bit tougher, and a little bit more prepared. And it was the backdrop for some of the most important political and social shifts in British history. I think there's something beautiful in that, in the way the boring daily struggle for warmth and light could lead to such profound changes, in the way a generation could take a cold, damp, and smoky world and start to turn it into something better, in the way they used their blankets, their coal, and their politics to build a future that we now take for granted. So the next time you feel a bit of a chill and you turn up your thermostat, think of the Edwardians. Think of the red flannel, the stone hot water bottles, and the 5-shilling pensions. Think of the boring history that made your comfort possible. The role of the Edwardian grandmother in this winter's survival was also crucial. She was the one who held the boring institutional memory of the family. She knew the home remedies for the winter cough, the best way to bank the fire, and how to stretch a pound of mutton through a whole week of stews. In a world before Dr. Google or YouTube tutorials, this oral tradition of survival was the only thing standing between a family and a very miserable winter. The boring wisdom of the elderly was a vital social resource, and the introduction of old age pensions was a political recognition of that value. It's also worth noting the boring history of the Edwardian scarf. We think of a scarf as an accessory, but in 1908, it was a piece of medical equipment. People would wrap them several times around their necks and over their mouths to filter out the soot and the sulfur of the pea soupers. The boring task of knitting these scarves occupied thousands of hours for Edwardian women. A well-knitted, thick wool scarf was a prized possession, a gift that was both practical and deeply emotional. It was a boring object that carried a lot of weight in the winter months. As the sun sets on our look at the general Edwardian winter, we see a society that was incredibly busy doing boring things. They were hauling, raking, scrubbing, knitting, and layering. They were arguing about coal prices and bread taxes. They were designing better stoves and more efficient houses. They were building a welfare state out of the frost and the fog. And they were doing it all with a sense of purpose and a touch of that famous British stoicism. Would you like me to continue with the next part of the script, focusing on the specific, boring science and economics of the Edwardian winter diet? I can get into the calorie counts of a typical suet pudding, the logistics of the London meat markets, and the political battles over the free trade loaf during the freezing winters of the early 1900s. So let's actually talk about that suet pudding, because if you want to understand how the Edwardians didn't just freeze into human icicles during the Great Frost of 1909, you have to understand the sheer unadulterated power of animal fat. We tend to think of the Edwardian diet as either Downton Abbey-style 10-course feasts or Oliver Twist-style watery gruel. But for the average person living through a brutal winter, the reality was a very calculated, very boring obsession with calories. And not just any calories. We are talking about dense, slow-burning, heavy-duty fuel. Enter the suet pudding. To a modern eye, a spotted dick or a treacle sponge looks like a heavy dessert you might regret the next day. To an Edwardian laborer or a London dock worker in January, it was a biological necessity. Suet is the hard fat found around the kidneys of beef or mutton, and it has a high melting point, which makes it perfect for long, slow steaming. When you mix that fat with flour and a bit of dried fruit, you aren't just making a treat. You are building a thermal layer inside your own body. A single serving of a dense, sweet pudding could easily pack 800 to 1,000 calories. In a world without central heating, where your body is constantly burning energy just to keep your internal temperature at a functional level, that pudding was basically a portable furnace. But the boring part isn't just the eating, it's the massive, sprawling logistics of how that food got to the table during a freeze. Think about the London meat markets like Smithfield. In the dead of winter, the logistics of moving thousands of carcasses through icy, narrow streets was a nightmare of epic proportions. You had horse-drawn carts slipping on frozen dung and cobblestones, workers with frost-bitten fingers heaving sides of beef, and the constant pressure of a city that would literally starve if the supply chain broke down for more than 48 hours. And this brings us to the real political battlefield of the Edwardian winter, the free trade loaf versus the tariff reform loaf. This might sound like the most tedious political debate in history, but back then it was the difference between a family eating dinner or going to bed with stomach cramps. The Conservative Party at the time, led by Joseph Chamberlain, wanted to introduce tariff reform, which basically meant putting taxes on imported grain from outside the British Empire to protect domestic farmers and strengthen imperial ties. The Liberals, on the other hand, campaigned on free trade, arguing that any tax on grain would make the price of a loaf of bread skyrocket. During the winter elections and the cold snaps of 1906 and 1910, the big loaf and the little loaf became the most potent symbols in British politics. And Liberal posters would show a massive, fluffy loaf of bread labeled "Retrade," next to a pathetic, shriveled little bun labeled "Tariff Reform." For a mother in a tenement in Manchester or a basement flat in Whitechapel, this wasn't an abstract economic theory. She knew that if the price of a loaf went up by even a half-penny, she wouldn't be able to afford the coal to bake it or the dripping to put on it. The winter diet was a fragile ecosystem of cheap calories, and the politics of the era were obsessed with keeping those calories flowing. If you looked into a typical Edwardian pantry in February, you wouldn't find fresh greens or exotic fruits. You would find the boring staples of survival: potatoes, onions, lard, tea, and condensed milk. Condensed milk was actually a high-tech marvel of the age. It was sweet, shelf-stable, and provided a massive hit of sugar and fat to people who couldn't afford fresh dairy or whose local milkman supply had frozen solid in the churns. It was the prepper food of the 1900s. People would stir it into their tea, which was the universal Edwardian antidepressant, and use it to stretch out porridges. And let's talk about tea for a second, because in the winter, tea wasn't just a beverage, it was a delivery system for heat. The sheer volume of tea consumed in Britain during a cold snap is staggering. It kept the hands warm, it hydrated the body without the risk of unboiled water, and it provided a social ritual that kept people from sinking into a total winter depression. Then there's the science of the one-pot meal. The Edwardian winter kitchen was dominated by the stew. This wasn't because they lacked imagination. But because of the boring reality of fuel efficiency. If you have a small coal range, you don't want to be heating 3 different pots. You want one heavy iron pot that sits on the hob all day, absorbing the heat and slowly breaking down the cheapest, toughest cuts of meat. The neck of mutton, the shin of beef, the pig's trotters. These cuts are full of collagen and connective tissue, which, when simmered for 6 hours, turn into a rich, gelatinous broth that coats the stomach and provides a sustained energy release. Science tells us now that these bone broths are incredibly nutrient-dense, but the Edwardians just knew they were filling. That word, filling, was the ultimate praise for a winter meal. If a meal wasn't filling, it was a failure as we move toward the end of our journey through the Edwardian frost. As we have to look at the people who were most vulnerable to these boring details, the elderly and the very young. In the early 1900s, the British government began to realize that they couldn't just leave winter survival to chance or private charity. The liberal reforms of 1906 to 1914, led by people like David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, were sparked in part by the realization that a huge portion of the British population was physically unfit because they couldn't survive the winter months without permanent damage to their health. This led to the introduction of the first old age pensions in 1908. It wasn't much, just 5 shillings a week, but for an elderly person in the winter of 1909, those 5 shillings meant they could buy the boring things that kept them alive: a bag of coal, a tin of condensed milk, and maybe a bit of suet for a pudding. It was the beginning of the modern welfare state, born out of the necessity of surviving the cold. The Edwardian winter was a time of intense, quiet struggle. It was a period where the majesty of the British Empire was balanced on the edge of a coal shovel and the price of a loaf of bread. It was a time when innovation meant a better way to knit a sock or a more efficient way to vent a chimney. When we look back at old photos of Edwardians in the snow with their long coats and their stoic expressions, we are seeing people who were masters of the boring art of persistence. They didn't have thermal leggings or electric blankets or weather apps to warn them of a coming blizzard. They had thick wool, heavy fat, and a communal understanding that if you didn't prepare, the winter would find you out. They built houses that were drafty by our standards, but were designed to gather the family around a single heat source. They created social clubs and friendly societies to pool their money so that no one in the neighborhood would have a cold hearth, a fireplace without coal. They developed a culture of making do, which sounds like a cliché, but was actually a sophisticated set of survival skills passed down through generations. They knew which side of the street stayed thawed the longest, how to use old newspapers to insulate a boot, and how to tell if the fog was just a mist or the deadly pea super smog that could kill a person with weak lungs in a single afternoon. And as the Edwardian era gave way to the horrors of the First World War, these boring lessons of winter survival became even more vital. The men who went to the trenches of Flanders were the same men who had grown up in the damp basements and cold tenements of Edwardian Britain. Their ability to endure the mud, the mold, and the privation wasn't just about military training. It was about a lifetime of experience in the boring history of surviving a British winter. They knew how to keep their feet dry, how to huddle for warmth, and how to appreciate the life-saving magic of a hot tin of tea. So, the next time you turn up your thermostat by a single degree, or complain that your puffer jacket is a bit too bulky, think about the Edwardians. Think about the servant girl waking up at 5 a.m. to scrub a freezing doorstep, the coal heaver carrying 60-pound sacks through a blizzard, and the mother carefully measuring out a spoonful of suet to keep her children warm. Their lives weren't defined by the grand speeches of kings or the signing of international treaties, though those things happened. Their lives were defined by the boring stuff, the coal, the wool, the bread, and the broth. It's a reminder that history isn't just a series of explosion and dramatic turning points. Most of history is just people trying to stay warm and fed. It's the story of how we adapted to our environment, how we took care of each other in the dark months, and how we used our ingenuity to turn a hostile, freezing world into a place where we could not only survive, but thrive. The Edwardian winter was brutal, yes, but it was also a catalyst for change. It forced a society to look at its poorest members and realize that a nation is only as strong as its ability to keep its people warm in February. As the frost finally began to melt each year and the first snowdrops appeared in the London parks, there was no doubt a collective sigh of relief that echoed across the country. But they didn't just forget the winter. They spent the spring and summer preparing for the next one. Because in the Edwardian mind, the boring work of survival never truly ended. It just changed shape with the seasons. They were a people defined by their resilience, their practicality, and their unwavering commitment to the small, mundane tasks that make life possible. And there is something deeply beautiful and anything but boring about that. I hope this deep dive into the freezing, coal-dusted, suet-filled world of the Edwardian winter has given you a new appreciation for the boring side of history. It's in these details: the weight of a coat, the price of a lump of coal, the steam from a pudding, that we find the real pulse of the past. It's a quiet pulse, often muffled by the snow, but it's there, beating steadily through the coldest nights of the 20th century. And now, as the imaginary coal fire in our story begins to dim and the Edwardian streets grow quiet under a blanket of frost, it's time to leave them to their rest. They've earned it. Would you like me to start a new deep dive into another boring but fascinating period, perhaps looking at the rigorous logistics of Victorian laundry or the surprisingly complex world of 19th century lighthouse keeping?